Okay, well, it's hard to believe that in 2025, as we're meant to be becoming much more evolved as a civilization, that in actual fact, there are conflicts that have broken out on a massive scale, Ukraine, Gaza being two, that have required and disrupted the world as much as it is. And even to the point now where countries are arming up all throughout the globe. China has evolved not simply as an economic but as a military superpower with weaponry that probably rivals, and in some cases, I've looked at certainly, would distance the West. The European British Prime Minister, a Labour Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has in recent days announced a unilateral increase in the number or the amount of military hardware and spending, defence spending that the British government will do. And ironically, in actual fact, suggested that it's going to come from the aid pot. So in other words, they're going to give less aid to overseas countries and spend more on military defence for themselves. And the Ukraine conflict has also meant that in places like Germany and France and Italy, countries that previously had taken a view that the world's okay and we're okay now and we're all getting on, are now going to be upping their arsenals as well. And that the Germans are actually going to spend some money on defence as well. Japanese are doing so, Taiwan. The world seems to be arming up. And Judith Collins, in looking at the advent of a relatively small flotilla, it has to be said, I think there are 3 ships and maybe there's a hidden submarine somewhere, having live fire exercises off the Australian coast, has also suggested we, New Zealand, we as in New Zealand, can't hide anymore. That we in actual fact are going to have to up our military spending as well as to be a part of all of this. Joining us to talk about that and where you might actually spend that money if we were going to, although I'd be also interested in what pot of money it might be coming from as well, because if, as Shane Jones said about Marsden Point oil refinery and why they're not going to go down that route, if you spend money on one thing, it's something else you're not spending money on. And he could think of 1,001 better priorities than the Marsden Point oil refinery being reconstituted. That was his message yesterday. Judith Collins, slightly different one. Well, anyhow, we're joined by Dr. Peter Greener. He's a senior fellow at the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria University. As I said, he was an honorary professor at the Command and Staff College of the New Zealand Defence Force. He should know what he's talking about on this issue, and he joins us now. Peter, lovely to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you very much indeed.
Now, listen, you would have heard my introduction on this. I'm bemused, indeed, I guess is the best word, because the world does seem to be arming up, and particularly the Western world, in response to what it perceives to be threats from not simply the Ukrainian conflict and perhaps a more expansionist Russia, but also particularly from China. That's our particular aegis at the moment. Can I ask you, do you think we spend too little on money at the moment? On defence, A, and B, if you were going to spend more money, how much and where?
Okay, well, thank you for that. Perhaps I could provide some context first of all. I've had connections now with the Command and Staff College of the Defence Force since 2008, and prior to that, I was head of the Department of Public Health and Psychosocial Studies up at AUT University. Quite a shift in trajectory, you might think.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
And so I have real concern about social spending, particularly when it comes to healthcare. But I have perhaps more concern about spending in the area of defence. New Zealand has always, in recent years, had a very modest defence force. And shortly after World War II, when we had an enormous defence force, those numbers rapidly dropped, and when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, New Zealand took a peace dividend, and over the next 7 years, with the national government from 1990 to 96, defence spending fell from 2% to 1%, which is where it stayed ever since. And that's just not been enough. What we've seen is a degrading of capability in the defence force over the last 35 years. And we're simply not spending enough on defence to maintain the modest military capabilities that we've had.
Let's put some numbers behind that at the moment. For the 24-25 budget, I think I'm reading here, Vote Defence Force, yes, the estimates, we spent just under $5 billion in the 24-5, or that's what's the allocation is for the current 24-5 year. 1.15 or $1.2 billion goes to the Army, 1.1 to the Air Force, and 782 for the Navy. And then there is more money on top of that as well, including for veterans defence and things like that. Those seem large sums of money to me to say that we're undercapitalised and incapable. Where are we incapable?
If you look at personnel numbers across the Defence Force, it looks as though we're in a very healthy position. There are more than 15,000 personnel in total. And if you put the reserves together with the regular force for the Army, there are over 6,000. And you would think that that was more than sufficient. But within those numbers, many of them are new or recent recruits. So what we've seen over the last 2 decades really has been the loss of capability from those with significant experience in trades which are critical across all 3 of the services. In particular, I'm thinking about engineers for the Navy, who receive an excellent training with the Navy, but then are sought after in Civvy Street. And at times like the present, the salaries and conditions of service for personnel just can't compete with what's happening outside in the broader world. I mention Navy particularly because you may be aware that we've had 3 ships in what's called care and protection since early 2022, tied up at the wharf in Devonport because we haven't had enough experienced and qualified sailors to put them to sea. It's compounded across all of the services by the lack of infrastructure for personnel. So in terms of spending, and this is where I agree wholeheartedly with Ron Mark, he was talking in the Otago Daily Times last week and saying that there are soldiers in barracks now, which he lived in when he was a 16-year-old recruit. And they haven't changed. There were families in the Navy living in damp houses, which are unhealthy for children, and that's simply not acceptable in the 21st century.
$5 billion is spent. $5 billion is spent on defence in 24-25. If you're going to spend more money, where would you spend it? And you're suggesting what on terms of personnel?
In the first place, yes, when you're looking at capability, the fundamental capability of any military, as we have seen with the Ukraine conflict, is in the personnel that you've got. You need to keep experienced people in the military in order to get the most out of the hardware that you've got. And I'm happy to talk about hardware. But
do we have too much hardware? I mean, you just talked about 3 ships being tied up and they haven't been moving for a number of years now because we don't have the personnel to look after them or to be able to service them properly. Does that suggest that we are over-hardwared, over-resourced in terms of capital expenditure?
Absolutely not. When you look at what we have responsibility for, we have an enormous exclusive economic zone which could well be a major economic driver for the future, but we need to look after it. We have, by some counts, the 5th, by others, the 6th largest economic zone in the world, covering about 11% of the globe, and we need to be able to protect it.
From whom?
From in our region and in the South Pacific, particularly from illegal and unreported fishing.
Okay, so we're essentially against fishing pirates, essentially. That's our primary problem in terms of our defence. I mean, that's a defence priority, is it? I'm not being facetious.